Hello, dear listener. Welcome to a 5-part series on the history of the church, brought to you by the Equip Project podcast. Welcome to our second episode of this special mini-series on church history. Last week we thought about the history of the early church, but this second episode is going to dig into the strange world of the early Middle Ages. Our job, Jim, is to work right up to 1000 AD. I'm sure you're looking forward to this journey through time.
I am, actually. I think I have fallen a little bit in love with the Middle Ages, and I'm also thrilled, Ollie, absolutely thrilled with the music that you have chosen to open these episodes. It's happy, it's energetic, infinitely better than the lugubrious synthesized dirge that normally introduces us.
I knew you'd enjoy it, Jim. I was like, this is right up Jim's street. But to be honest, I am hoping to steal your phone at some point and actually put the standard Equip theme tune as both your alarm and your ringtone. In our first episode, Jim, we didn't quite make it to 500 AD actually, so we'll have to race over the events of the 5th century as well as the early Middle Ages. But to begin with, would you mind just sketching out for us the basic history of events between the 5th and 10th centuries? Just some headlines that might allow us to see the big picture and kind of orientate ourselves a bit. And then once you've done that, I'll set out how we're going to structure this episode.
Okay. I find it helpful to think about 3 big movements in this historical period. So we'll think about the collapse of the Roman Empire, then we'll consider the rise of Islam, and then we'll talk about the arrival of Christendom. So the Roman Empire collapses in the 5th century, and that reduces the 6th century to chaos, particularly in the West. In the 7th and early 8th centuries, we witness the rise of Islam, with Muslim armies almost succeeding in conquering Europe. And then in the 8th century, we encounter Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, as he is better known. And it is Charlemagne who establishes the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne really is the father of Europe, and he creates this thing that we now call Christendom, a Christian empire. So those are the 3 big movements: the collapse of the Roman Empire, the rise of Islam, and the arrival of Christendom.
Brilliant. And we can't really hope to understand the history of the church until we have some understanding of the historical context, right, Jim? Mm-hmm. So could you sketch in for us the first of your 3 movements, the collapse of the Roman Empire?
Well, in last week's episode, we talked about the Roman Emperor Diocletian, who's known as the persecutor of the church. The strange thing is that in many ways he was a highly effective ruler. The governance of Rome in the 3rd century was a mess. If you think about the 25 emperors before Diocletian, 21 of them were assassinated. The life expectancy of a Caesar in that period was worse than the life expectancy of a gladiator.
Oh, wow.
Yes. I mean, the army was completely out of control. So Diocletian realized that the empire was just too big to be managed as a single unit. So he divided it up into 4 imperial courts, and that fairly quickly got reduced to 2. But in effect, the city of Rome got sidelined because the new headquarters of the empire, where all the action was, that was in the east, in Constantinople.
Yeah, and that division of the empire into east and west had major implications for the church, didn't it? Because it explains why we have the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church today. And we'll think about that in a moment. But in political terms, what were the consequences for people living in what we now call Europe?
Well, they were disastrous. The Roman legions who guarded the northern border of the empire, they were largely withdrawn, and so hordes of Germanic tribes started to arrive. These are the people we call the Goths and the Vandals and the Franks, and then further back there were the Saxons and the Angles. And Rome was attacked quite a few times, but officially it fell in 476 AD. From that point on, no Roman emperor ever ruled from Italy. So that moment is regarded as the death blow to the Western Empire.
Psychologically, that must have been a nightmare because Rome was called the Eternal City.
Exactly, and that is the context in which Augustine writes his famous book called The City of God. He used the crisis to explain to Christians the truth, actually, that you expounded on Sunday morning, Ollie, from Daniel chapter 2. Earthly kingdoms rise and fall. It's only the kingdom of God that is eternal. And Augustine very helpfully positioned Christians as resident aliens. In other words, we do our best to improve things in the here and now, we engage in public affairs, but our citizenship is in heaven.
And as you just said, Jim, that the fallout from the collapse of the Western Empire was terrible. Life for ordinary people was frightening and grim, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, it was so grim, in fact, that many Christians believed that the end of the world was imminent. They really thought they were living through the apocalypse, through the book of the Revelation. In the year 590, the Pope that we call Gregory the Great wrote a letter about the situation, and it's very moving. And he says, "Everywhere we see tribulation, everywhere we hear lamentation. The cities are destroyed, the castles torn down, the fields laid waste, the land made desolate. Villages are empty, few inhabitants remain in the cities, and even those poor remnants of humanity are daily cut down." So it was a time of great confusion and danger. There's an historian called Gregory of Tours, and he wrote this massive history of the period. And he begins with what I believe is the greatest opening line of any book ever written. "A great many things keep happening, some of them good, some of them bad."
I know you're passionate about that quote, Jim, because you sent it to me on WhatsApp a few days ago with very little context. And it also features on your Facebook bio.
It just makes me laugh. I mean, sometimes these figures from the Middle Ages can seem remote and intimidating, but you read that opening line and you know you're in the presence of this wearied project manager slumped over his desk with his head in his hands, unable to cope with the chaos that's going on around him. I mean, anyone who's ever worked in corporate life knows that Gregory of Tours empathizes with him. A great many things keep happening, some of them good, some of them bad.
It is fantastic. The Eastern Empire seemed a lot more secure throughout this period. But then in the 7th and 8th centuries, we see the rise of Islam.
Yes. We need to appreciate just how aggressive the military campaigns of the Muslim armies were. I mean, round about the year 634, the terrible news spread across the church that the Muslims had captured Jerusalem. They had already invaded Iran and Iraq and Central Asia, and in the year 670 came the first raid into North Africa, with thousands of Christians taken into slavery. Then in the fateful year 695, the guards standing on the walls of Carthage looked into the distance and they saw a little cloud of dust. And then a little while later they saw sunlight glittering on swords and armour. And then came the siege machines and the fearsome armies of the Muslim invaders. When we move into the 8th century, we watch the Muslim armies attack Constantinople itself, and Muslim pirates infested the Mediterranean.
And it wasn't long after that that the Muslim armies invaded Spain, was it?
That's right. If you've ever visited the Alhambra near Murcia in Spain, you can see the historical evidence of that invasion. But that wasn't the end of the story. The Muslim armies then crossed the Pyrenees into France. And one of the most important battles in world history took place in the year 732 in western France. It's called the Battle of Tours. If the Franks had lost that battle, then Europe would have been Islamicized. I think it's ironic that the Islamicization of Europe that's taking place today is centred in France. Now, all that military history is important because it provides the right historical context for the Crusades of the High Middle Ages. Now, I'm not for a moment trying to defend the Crusades, but we shouldn't forget that they were attempts to retake territory that Muslim armies had seized ruthlessly earlier on in the story.
The victory for the Franks at the Battle of Tours paved the way for the man we call Charlemagne, Charles the Great. And he really forged what we call Europe. The Holy Roman Empire reached across Italy, France, and Germany.
Yes, the Holy Roman Empire wasn't actually dissolved until, I think it was 1806, by Napoleon. But anyway, Charlemagne's reign wasn't just about military dominance. He brought about military, religious, and intellectual reformation. Church and state were the twin pillars on which Christendom was built. He was determined to build a Christian empire. So the clergy had to be educated properly. Monasteries were instructed to establish schools that gave boys a Christian education. And Charlemagne invented this concept called the king's envoys. I mean, they were essentially government inspectors. But the king's envoys always were a double act between a noble and a bishop. So there you have church and state riding side by side. And Charlemagne ended up dominating the church in much the way that the emperors of the Eastern Empire, who we now call Byzantine emperors, the way they governed the Orthodox Church. Now, I feel the need to give you a random fact at this point, Ollie.
I love your random facts, Jim. I'm hoping it's something to do with busking.
No, it's not. It's much better. Charlemagne leaned very heavily throughout his reign on an Englishman called Alcuin of York. And he provided a really helpful Christian influence in the emperor's life. So in the year 776, Charlemagne had forced the Saxons to be baptized, but he did it at the point of a sword. And Alcuin gently persuaded the emperor that conversion to Christianity shouldn't be achieved through coercion. Now, Alcuin is best known for leading the intellectual renaissance of the period. But here's my useless fact. Alcuin is the man who invented the question mark.
Wow. Well, I must say, I've always wondered who invented the question mark. And that's just one of the many reasons I'm thankful for you, Jim, providing me with that sort of information. It's much appreciated. I think we've done enough to establish the historical context for the church's story in this historical period. We've thought about three great movements in the 5th to the 10th centuries: the collapse of the Roman Empire, the rise of Islam, and the arrival of Christendom. So let's now return to church history particularly, and I want to divide the church's story throughout this period of time into three strands. So we'll think first of the development of the church as an institution. Then I want to think briefly about a key feature of the Christian story in this period, and that is the impact of monasteries. The monastic life was a key feature of Christianity right throughout the Middle Ages. And then finally, as we did last week, we'll consider the Christian story at its deepest level and look at the emergence of ideas, the slow emergence of a new worldview that took place over these centuries.
I think we should use the wisdom of Gregory of Tours here and recognize that some of the many things that happened were good and some were bad. So for each strand, we'll consider the good things and then the bad things, okay?
Brilliant. Sounds great. That's the plan. And to kick off our discussion about the evolution of the church as an institution, I want to raise a question that one of our listeners asked about last week's episode. You described the Emperor Constantine's decision to make Christianity the state religion of Rome as a disaster, and I'm sure our listeners want you to defend that position.
Well, it's an excellent question, but before I answer it, I should probably clarify something that I said in our first episode. So I said last week that I think the phrase I used, an unashamed primitivist. In other words, I personally regard the pattern of church governance laid down in the New Testament as normative.
That's something you can add to your Facebook bio.
As normative, I'm going to ignore that, as normative for all cultures and historical eras, okay? Now, in this episode, I am going to be critical of the development of the church as a big global institution, but I wouldn't want anyone to think that we're sort of sitting here, Ollie, feeling smug because we've got church governance right and everyone else got it wrong. I am acutely aware that the history of primitive churches, of sort of back to the Bible churches, that history is littered with terrible mistakes. And I promise that we'll stare those difficulties in the face in our final episode, okay? So please be assured that any criticisms that I make of ecclesiastical structures don't come from a feeling of smug superiority. We've all messed up in one way or another, okay? So let's answer the question you raised by rewinding the story back to the start of the 4th century, just for a moment. You see, before Constantine's conversion, people joined the Christian church because they had been persuaded that Christianity was true. They went through a genuine conversion. But once Christianity became the state religion, people started to pile in because it was the fashionable thing to do, or because it would help them get on in life. Declaring oneself to be a Christian soon became a route to power and influence. So I think that move was a disaster because it brought thousands and thousands of people into the church who still had a pagan mindset. And in these early years, the church moved away from the New Testament model of individual churches governed by elders and deacons. Before long, the term bishop started to mean more than church elder. It referred to the leading Christian leader in that city. Before long, the church morphed into an institution that mirrored the governance structure of the Roman Empire. The bishops in large cities were higher up in the hierarchy than the bishops of small cities. Then region-wide structures developed. Rome became responsible for Italy, Carthage for North Africa, Alexandria for Egypt, Antioch for Syria, and so on. And then once the empire split into east and west, the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Constantinople became in effect joint heads of the church. And by the end of the 4th century, the Pope in Rome had adopted the ancient pagan title of Pontifex Maximus. Now, we don't yet see the infrastructure of, church lawyers and canon law and so on that we see develop in the High Middle Ages. We'll talk about that next week. But the superstructure of a global institution is in place.
And from what you've said and are saying, you see this as a bad thing. Am I right? And I guess to follow on from that, couldn't you argue that the church as an institution achieved some really good and helpful things in the first millennium when this structure was in place.
Well, I think that argument can be made, and we'll return to it. But the advocate for primitivism would argue that the New Testament model of governance has been carefully designed, and in particular, it's been designed to minimize the spread of false ideas. So, in the very earliest days of the church, a specific church fellowship could become so riddled with error that it became apostate. We know that. I mean, a church like Laodicea, for example. But that poison didn't spread throughout all the other churches because they were separate. The system had resilience because in the picture given to us in the book of the Revelation, the church wasn't a single big lampstand with, like the nation of Israel. Each individual church had its own individual lampstand that Christ could remove. But in a hierarchical institution, an error at the top could propagate through the entire system and poison everyone, and I'm afraid that that is what happened. But you are right, Ollie, that the church as an institution did a lot of good. It would be mean-spirited of me not to admit that. I mean, if we go back to our discussion about the collapse of the empire in the West, the senior clergy were the only governance structure left standing in the West. So they were really more like diplomats and administrators. They had to become that. In the year 452, it is Pope Leo who negotiates with Attila the Hun. In the centuries that followed, the senior bishops lead efforts to civilize the Germanic tribes. Under the Franks, the 6th and 7th century councils of the church were dominated by questions of public morality and welfare. The clergy succeeded in introducing the norm of charity into the sphere of public policy. And their influence is clear in the legal texts that have been preserved from that period of time. I mean, you probably find this interesting. Most normal human beings wouldn't. But if you take the legal codes of the Visigoths in the 6th century, their law becomes more and more democratic rather than aristocratic, because suddenly all men start to have equal value under the law. Now, that hugely important change is down to the church. But perhaps the most strategic impact of the church as an institution in this period is what we might call the democratic mandate of the bishops. Because the church had such a care for the poor, the bishops began to speak with real authority on behalf of everyone in society. Their rhetoric encouraged women, the urban poor, even slaves to feel part of the city in a way that had previously been impossible. So a lot of scholars trace the source of real democracy to the role played by bishops in these early centuries. The atheist philosopher Luke Ferry is a good example of somebody who supports that thesis. Christianity introduced the notion that humanity was fundamentally identical, he says, that men were equal in dignity. An unprecedented idea at the time, and one to which our world owes its entire democratic inheritance.
Okay, so the church as an institution did some really good and important things, is what you're saying. But a lot of things did start to go wrong, didn't they?
Yes, I think there were two main problems. Firstly, thousands of people who were basically pagan were being baptized into the church. So although by the 6th century pagan temples and amphitheatres were being used as quarries for building materials, the spirit of paganism was still well and truly alive. Just think of the enormous number of interceding saints or relics that became part of the Christian scene in the Middle Ages. The original gospel becomes buried under a mountain of superstitious pagan ideas. And we need to ask why that state of affairs arose. Larry Sedentop explains the veneration of saints and their relics. He explains that as a benign afterlife for polytheism. Okay? He says, that veneration repeopled the religious world with more familiar and approachable, less intimidating figures. So St. Anthony looked after the welfare of pigs. And for many simple peasants, St. Anthony was much more important to them than Christ. Okay, so that's the first problem, the baptizing of old pagan ideas and practices into church life. The second problem is maybe best summed up in the word control. I speak to my own heart here, but maybe the biggest temptation facing any Christian leader is to panic when events hit us and to react like a control freak. Remember that the church had been seriously spooked by the controversies over heresies in earlier centuries. So this creeping desire to control starts to seep into the system. And I think that's maybe the best way to understand what I regard as the unbiblical concept of penance. Now, I want to talk about penance for a minute because its introduction had a chilling effect on Christianity. Now, the New Testament does have the idea of church discipline. It gives us some principles about how to discipline church members who have sinned grievously. In extremely rare occasions, a period of excommunication from the church might be needed in order to help someone along the path to restoration. But that idea was taken and twisted by a hierarchical institution. It was altered into something that I think is unbiblical, this doctrine of penance.
And maybe the central problem with the doctrine is that the church as an institution starts to push itself between the individual and Christ with this practice of absolution.
By the time you get to the 12th century, the famous Bonaventura says that it was not sufficient for a Christian to confess their sins to God. It was the church that granted absolution. So in effect, your eternal destiny is no longer in the hands of Christ. It is de facto in the hands of the church. And that same controlling instinct can be seen in the way the authority of the Scriptures is taken over by the church. I'm talking here about the development of the magisterium, which sets the church as an institution over the Scriptures. Way back in the 4th century, Gregory of Nyssa takes that moment from the book of Exodus, so, that moment when Moses climbs Mount Sinai to get the Ten Commandments while the rest of the Israelites cower in fear. And Gregory uses that passage to say, the multitude could not hear the voice from above, but left it to Moses to learn for himself the hidden secrets and to teach the people whatever divine truths he might acquire from the teaching from above. The same is true of the ordering of the church. Whenever I read that quote, I want to shout out, sola scriptura. But that controlling attitude within the institution created this ever-widening gulf between the clergy and lay Christians. And by the time that thoroughly bad idea had run its course, the magisterium of the High Middle Ages was in place. The church had become the mother of the book. Now, of course, many of our listeners might disagree vigorously with that analysis, but I would humbly suggest that it helps explain how the entire mood of the Christian faith changes over these centuries. And there is a massive change in mood. The gladness and joy of the early church, rejoicing in sins forgiven, that morphs into this tormented fear over the horrors of purgatory. So if you disagree with my analysis, you need to explain that terribly sad historical fact. In my view, the church was never designed to be an institution that controlled its members by making them nervous and guilty.
And given the sheer complexity of church history, we don't really have time to discuss the Eastern Church, which we know as the Orthodox Church. But can you at least say a few sentences about its history, and then we'll revert to the story of the Western Church?
Okay. I said a minute or two ago that the bishops of Rome and Constantinople were effectively joint heads of the church for a while. And it was, shall we say, a fractious relationship. There's a moment at the end of the 6th century when the Eastern Patriarch, John IV, adopted the title Universal Bishop. Okay? And back in Rome, Gregory the Great was really, really irritated by this title, and he did his best to have it overturned. He called it foolish, proud, profane, wicked, pestiferous, blasphemous, diabolical usurpation. He compared anyone who used it to Lucifer. You see, that's the problem with job titles in the church. But now, the split between the Roman Church and the Eastern Church, it didn't officially happen until the Great East-West Schism of 1054 AD. But the truth is, of course, that the two institutions started to drift apart 600 years earlier. So the Orthodox regard the fusion of church and state as a glorious thing. For the Byzantine Church, the emperor in the world was the same as the sun in heaven. Constantine once built a chapel with 13 symbolic tombs in it, 12 for the apostles and 1 for him. So really, in Orthodox thinking, the state is the church, in effect. The other obvious feature of the Orthodox Church is its use of icons in worship. Now, that is a complicated subject, and today there are some fiercely intelligent men who inhabit the cloisters of Orthodox theology. I'm thinking of men like Jonathan Pajot. But no matter how sophisticated their intellectual arguments, we can't escape the simple fact that icons always lead to idolatry. Now, I'm not, of course, saying there are no true believers within the Orthodox Church. Of course there are thousands and thousands of them, thank the Lord. But the extraordinary rituals found in the Orthodox Church will never lead anyone to the truth. Smells and bells are no substitute for studying the Scriptures. Only a Protestant could make such an irritating comment. In historical terms, the Byzantine Church survived for many centuries before that part of the world was overrun by Muslim armies. So, trapped between the Roman heretics in the west and the Islamic heresies to the east, the Orthodox had only one escape route, and that was north. So they headed into the Balkan states and on into Russia. So for the Russian Church, Moscow became the third Rome. The first Rome was lost to the Latin heretics. The second Rome, Constantinople, had been lost to the Muslims. But Moscow was their new Rome.
So we've thought about the history of the institutional church in the early Middle Ages. But there is one other strand of Christianity that develops in this period, and I'm thinking about monasteries. Could you give us a brief overview of the monastic life and why it was so... It sounds as though when I ask that, you've lived the monastic life, and so I'm laughing. But I'll ask the question nonetheless. Can you give us a brief overview of the monastic life and why it was important in historical terms? I mean, maybe you have experienced it, I don't know. But
I've been accused of many things in my life, Ollie, but never of being a monk. The monastic life began as a sort of protest movement. Individual hermits chose to live a bit like John the Baptist, living out in the desert outside of the power structures of urban life. I mean, they were all wild eccentrics. But hermit life quickly developed into monastic community life. Now, it's Athanasius who established them in the West. The key person, of course, in this whole story of monasticism is Benedict. In the 6th century, Benedict monasteries start to spread and have real influence, and they introduce this new conception of community into the ancient world. I mean, it's an utterly new form of social organization.
And I'm interested to know what you think the pros and cons of this monastic life were.
Well, I can think of 3 good features. First, they conducted a great deal of the evangelistic missionary work throughout the Middle Ages. I mean, Celtic Christianity, it plays a massively important role in the history of the church, and I'm not saying that because we happen to be sitting here in Ireland. No one should ever underestimate the strategic significance of Patrick. Christianity in Ireland was almost entirely monastic, but it then spread across to Scotland and then southwards into England. Celtic missionaries like Columbanus then evangelized continental Europe. They established monasteries in Germany and Switzerland and North Italy, and they seem to have taught the gospel to their converts. So in that sense, they offer a welcome contrast to the sort of mass conversions that occurred among the Franks. The Franks were introduced to Christianity by followers of the Arian heresy. So for them, Christ was really just more like another warlord. The Franks particularly admired the Apostle Peter because he had tried to cut off Malchus's ear with a sword. Okay. But in contrast to that utterly shallow and distorted understanding of the gospel, the Celtic missionaries do seem to have taught something much closer to biblical Christianity. The second good thing that monastic life introduced was the Christian concept of work. This may seem like a random thing to say, but the early chapters of Genesis go out of their way to honour the idea of work. But in pagan thought, work was done by slaves. Work was seen as demeaning. There's a famous story told of the philosopher Plato, who saw 2 of his students building a little machine to help them with their geometry calculations. Now, it was an extraordinarily clever little device. But Plato went nuts because he so despised the concept of manual labour. Wise men never got their hands dirty, according to the Greek philosophers. But in contrast, when you look at the monasteries, we see the importance attached to work in the Christian worldview. Basil of Caesarea urged, we must not use the ideal of piety as an excuse for idleness or a means of escaping toil. Basil discouraged excessive asceticism. Instead, monks were to involve themselves in the life of the world around them. They were to found schools and hospitals. Now, as I say, that might seem like an arbitrary point, but we're going to see next week it was an essential prerequisite to the rise of science in the West. The final praiseworthy thing to say about monasteries is, of course, the best known. Western monasteries, in the face of invasions and the collapse of empire, became refuges for community and learning. Monks became scholars. They preserved literature and culture throughout the most chaotic period in European history. If you have any love for literature or art, then you have reason to be grateful to the monks of the Middle Ages.
On the flip side, though, there were big problems with living as a monk, weren't there?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest criticism of monastic life is that it's unnatural. I mean, asceticism was in many ways the spirit of the age in these centuries, cutting oneself off from the possibility of life as a husband and father, kneeling for hours on a cold stone floor, fasting, wearing hair shirts, all that sort of thing. It was based on the idea of mortifying the flesh. One monk famously said, "The soul is chained to the flesh as a prisoner to the corpse." Now, that quotation is very revealing. It shows us that asceticism has its roots in Gnosticism. Okay? Because remember, the Gnostics believed that the human body was evil. Now, that Gnostic view of the body also explains why the Church in the Middle Ages had such a distorted view of sex. It was taught that sexual desire was a result of the fall, for example. So once again, you can see the disastrous consequences of allowing pagan ideas to merge with Christianity.
Okay, so we've thought about the development of the church as an institution and the rise of monasteries. To finish this episode, Jim, I'd like to turn now to the development of ideas, to investigate how the new Christian worldview started to take root in culture. So we'll follow Gregory of Tours once more and think first of some of the good things that happened and then the bad ones.
Okay, the really good thing, the absolutely crucial thing that we see develop in this period is the notion of the individual. Okay, we talked in our first episode about how the Christian worldview slowly started to displace the cruel assumptions that the Romans and the Greeks had about humanity. We saw last week how Christianity started to change that view. Christians stood for the immutable dignity of all human beings. Now, the impact of Christianity ran deeper than a simple elevation of status for slaves and women, much deeper. Christianity introduces the idea of the individual. Now, we instinctively conceive of society as an association of individuals. But the ancient Romans and Greeks didn't think like that. Only citizens, the heads of families who had civic prominence, were individuals as we might think of them now. In other words, they believed that different levels of status reflected inherent differences of being. That's why Aristotle described slaves as living tools. Some are free men and others slaves by nature, he said. They were a different type of creature from a citizen. But with Christianity, we now see humans as rational agents with the ability to reason and choose. So that forces us to attribute to them an underlying equality of status, a moral equality. The Lord Jesus and Paul overturn the assumption of natural inequality by creating this inner link between God and a morally responsible individual. Christianity offered anyone, no matter what their social status, direct access to the deepest level of reality within their own heart. So the notion of the self was changed completely in Western culture. Augustine played a big part in transmitting the Apostle Paul's sophisticated view of the human will and human motivation to future generations. And it was a revolution in thought that led to a system of justice founded on moral equality rather than so-called natural inequality. And it is astonishing, Ollie, how many atheist and agnostic thought leaders are now making this point today. Just in the past week, men like Matthew Paris and Niall Ferguson have joined the guys I mentioned in the previous episode. There's now this view that Christianity released the freedom and power of human agency into the world. This is the depth charge we talked about in our first episode, and it led eventually to human rights and the abolition of slavery.
Already in this series, Jim, I can see that you're building up an argument. You're arguing that Christianity builds the foundation on which the blessings of the modern world rest. If that is true, why did it take so long to develop? Just to take an example, if Christianity is responsible for putting the building blocks in place that led to the rise of science, then why did the church resist Galileo so fiercely?
Well, that question brings us to the bad things that happened in the development of ideas. And we'll talk a lot more about the rise of science in our next episode. But you raise the most important objection to my thesis. If Christianity is the source of the valuable elements in modern society, why did we have such a mess for 1,000 years? And the short answer is that, unfortunately, the worldview that developed in the Middle Ages was not Christian. It was an amalgam, a weird fusion of Christian and pagan ideas.
And that happened, Jim, because of the influx of pagan thinking that came into the church and which then infected the institution at its top levels.
That's right. It's actually quite difficult to explain the sheer weirdness of the medieval mind. So I'm going to have to build up a picture. The first thing I'm going to do is recount a popular story from the Middle Ages, okay? So if you're sitting comfortably, then I will begin.
Can't wait.
It's called Percival and the Quest for the Holy Grail. It's great fun to read if you enjoy stories of brave knights rescuing beautiful and virtuous damsels in distress. And a young boy called Percival is raised by his mother in the woods of Wales, and he longs to go off on an adventure. So he makes his way on this ragged old nag of a horse to King Arthur's court. And a battle with one of Arthur's enemies, called the Red Knight, gives the boy his first set of armour. Percival has a destiny that he doesn't know anything about. He has been chosen to heal the last guardian of the Holy Grail. He has to ask the wounded king, or the Fisher King as he's called, a simple question. And if he does so, that will cause the Grail to heal the king. But out of politeness, he doesn't ask the question. And he leaves the scene and gets cursed by a witch. And once the situation has been explained to him, he goes on this long quest, meeting adventure after adventure, until eventually he re-enters the presence of the Fisher King. An angelic voice commands him to ask the question. He leans over the wounded man and gently asks the question, and at once the king springs back to full vigour and health. Now, that story is actually an ancient Celtic myth. But in the Middle Ages, it gets loaded up with Christian symbolism. So in some accounts, the Holy Grail is the cup that the Lord Jesus uses in the Last Supper. In others, the Holy Grail was formed from a precious jewel that fell from Lucifer's crown when he was cast down from heaven. Once forged into a small vessel, it was given to Joseph of Arimathea, and perchance some drops of the Saviour's blood fell into the Grail when he was preparing the Lord's body for burial. Words from God written in fire would occasionally light up the vessel. And at the end of the story, as told in the Middle Ages, once the Fisher King has been restored to health, the Grail floods the castle with light. And I'm just going to quote from the legend itself now. All were bathed with its refulgent glow. The Saracen, Fearfus, alone remained untouched by the marvellous light, since it never rested on any save those of the Christian faith. Nevertheless, so impressed was he by all that he saw that he professed his faith in the creed of the knights and begged to be baptized. And according to the legend, the convert's son becomes the founder of the Knights Templar.
It's definitely an Equip audiobook in that, Jim. I can say you were getting into it there. I could sense it. And it is an exciting story, but I see the point you're trying to make. A lot of old pagan myths and ideas get sort of baptized into Christianity.
And so that's the basic thing I was trying to get across. Now, at the level of intellectual thought, that same unfortunate process occurred. Medieval intellectuals thought completely differently from the way we think. They developed what we might call a theory of everything. Scholars had this incredibly elaborate model of the universe that they thought explained how every aspect of reality fitted together. There was a place for everything, and everything was in its place. I mean, you're probably familiar with their cosmology, which was lifted straight from Greek philosophy. Everything below the moon was the world of change and flux. That's the world we inhabit. But above the moon was the realm of perfection. That was the world of stars, heaven, angels, and God. And then below the earth there was hell. But even hell was an incredibly structured realm. In Dante's Divine Comedy, there were 9 circles of hell. And medieval thinkers fitted just about everything into their model. There were complicated hierarchies of angels and saints. I mean, they loved making lists of things, you know. The natural world was categorized and placed within a hierarchical model. And even things like musical chords were linked to geometry and cosmology. So it was one big theory of everything.
And it's just so hard to think yourself into a worldview like that, isn't it? I mean, we live in a culture that has the very opposite approach to the world. While the medieval mind saw the universe as teeming with purpose and significance, we see it as nothing but atoms. All meaning and significance and purpose have effectively been ripped out of the external world and brought into our own minds.
That's absolutely right. It's a great summary. We shouldn't sneer at the medievals just because their worldview wasn't true, because our worldview is even madder. But anyway, for our purposes today, the question we need to ask is, how did their model come about? And the answer is that it developed by mixing up Greek ideas with Christianity. In the early centuries, the ideas of Plato were assimilated because they were available in some Latin writings. And then later on, when Aristotle was rediscovered, his ideas were incorporated. C.S. Lewis wrote a book about the medieval mind. It's called The Discarded Image. Most of it was beyond me, to be honest. But I got the sense that in the Middle Ages, everyone was incredibly deferential to ancient writings. If something had been written a long time ago, no one seemed to dare to disagree with it. So unfortunately, a lot of Greek writings were not discarded by Christian theologians, and instead of just disagreeing with Greek and Roman thinkers, they did their best to incorporate everything they said into this giant model of reality, into their theory of everything. And in his book, Lewis gives an example of what this sort of amalgam of Christian and classical thought looked like. Apparently there's a little chapel built inside a famous basilica in Rome. I think it's called the Chigi Chapel, if I've pronounced that correctly. And the paintings on the ceilings are really interesting. The painting on the dome show God the Father sitting at the centre of reality. And he is surrounded by the planets, along with the signs of the zodiac, and then by the apostles. And the entire mural is designed a bit like a hub and spoke. So there's change and chaos on the edges, but at the centre we see the serenity of the unmoved mover. So that is clearly a weird mixture of Christian and Greek thought going on.
And that helps answer the question about Galileo. So when Galileo had his little spat with Pope Urban, the Pope wasn't defending Christianity at all, was he? He was actually defending Aristotle's cosmology. He was defending the model of the universe that was a weird amalgam of Christian and pagan ideas.
Yes. We've been doing this for far too long, so we'll finish off now. But I want to close by returning to the first strand you identified in this period. The discussion about the development of the church as an institution. You see, the syncretism we've just been talking about took root in the medieval mind because it was cascaded down from the top of a hierarchy. The big problem with an institutionalized church is that it creates a single point of failure. Once false ideas get in, the whole system gets poisoned. And that, Ollie, is perhaps the strongest argument for primitivism. Of course, as we shall eventually find out, there are strong arguments against primitivism as well.
Thanks, Jim. Fascinating stuff. Our next episode is going to consider the High Middle Ages, and that's the period from the 11th century to the 15th century. But for now, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. Please do continue to share this podcast with friends and family.